Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton. And this week we are going to be talking about emotions. And we're going to start off with this little debate that Mark and I have been having. So I'm going to start by sharing my side of the debate, and it's surrounding emotions. And I would say that having children is purely an emotional thing. And this is not me against children. I have 3 kids. I love them, and I would go through everything all over again just to have all 3 of them. But in this day and age, since birth control became so readily available, there is no rational or logical reason to have children.
No, okay, but what's the emotion that drives you to having kids? I'm curious about that.
My entire life I've wanted kids. I mean, most little girls talk about dreaming of their wedding day and being a bride, and I dreamed about being a mom. I freaked my mom out when I was really young because I used to pretend to be pregnant. I would stuff like pillows and dolls and stuff up my shirt. And it scared her.
She was probably terrified for your teenage years.
Right? Yeah, that's exactly what it was. She was so worried. But I was 3 years old, and my favorite story was the story of Mary when she gave birth to Jesus, because I loved pregnant women. I loved the look of them. I loved the roundness of their bellies. And throughout into adulthood, I carried that. I loved seeing pregnant women, and it freaked my mom out. Anyways, so I've always wanted to be a mom, and I would say religion has a big part of it for me. And I think that drives probably a lot of people. But I mean, if you really think about it from a rational, logical standpoint, children suck everything out of you. They will take up all of your time, half your money, and you will lose all of your freedom and independence. But it's totally worth it to me. I would do it all again for my kids.
But what do you get from having children? Like, what's the emotional payback you get? Joy, happiness?
Yes. Yeah.
And don't you get an incredible amount of joy?
Absolutely. Yes. And maybe that's why I continue to keep having more kids. And maybe I should say it's illogical and irrational to have more than one kid, because most people want at least one. But then after they do it one time, what is the logical or rational reason to go through that again?
Well, I can give you the logical reason. The logical reason to have 2 is it's in the best interest of the first child.
That's
it's in
true.
the best interest of the first child to give that child a sibling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Psychologically speaking, anyway.
I can see that.
Here's how I differ. See, I really believe in evolution. I believe that, Charles Darwin, this idea that a lot of our behaviors are based on really the perpetuation of the species. Mm-hmm. Because I think, like any organism's drive is to reproduce itself.
Yes.
And so I think that I don't know if you felt this. I think Lindy has talked about how she felt this, that it's hard to describe the desire to have a child. And I think it's an instinctual thing that we come with in order to keep the species going. And so is it an emotional thing? I think we get a lot as parents, a lot of joy from having children. But I think if you go back 10,000 years, it's definitely about instinct to.
Exactly. And as a species, you're right. We are designed to want to procreate. And we all have very powerful sexual urges, which definitely stems from the need to continue the species, that need and that drive to want to have intimate relationships, because that's how children are created. But since birth control has become readily available, it's really easy not to get pregnant, to avoid pregnancy.
That's true. It is. And so I think that, it's one of the things that, for a lot of reasons, fuels more women going out and having affairs. I mean, that's one of the things is because they have a lot easier time with the birth control, So I think it's instinctual in us to want to procreate. I don't think it's about emotion. And I think personally that we get a lot of, nowadays for most parents, like I know, I just get a lot of satisfaction and joy from my kids and my grandkids especially.
Oh, so do I. And I love being a mom. I'm a stay-at-home mom, and I have been since the birth of my first kid, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. I mean, I am nothing but grateful to Curtis for working as hard as he has throughout our entire marriage to give me the ability to be a stay-at-home mom to raise my kids. But I mean, it seems completely illogical and irrational to ever have a child now that I've been through it.
Well,
But I would do it again,
maybe
and it's purely emotional.
I probably agree that it's illogical and not rational. But you know what? A lot of things in our world are illogical and not rational.
And you once said that emotions
Are very rational.
are
Yeah,
very rarely rational. So,
yeah.
anyways, that's my debate. And if you ask me, proof is in the pudding because
Okay.
as a species, we're no longer procreating enough
That's true.
to sustain the population at the rate we're going. So,
Right. But that means that people could still be having one child or two children,
mhm,
and that you would still be in this same problem. I think it's true
that's
that
true.
people aren't having as many children as
Yes.
they may have in the past.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well, you think about 100 years ago, if you were a sexually active married couple, you were going to keep having children
Right. And if you
most of the
were,
time.
if you were on the farm, you actually needed, or a ranch,
Yes.
or something like
Hmm.
that, you needed the kids to help out. So
Yeah. Yeah.
they're,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the 1800s, that was a big thing is, the more kids you had, the more help you had for whatever industry you were in. But, that's not the case anymore. Anyways, so
should we talk about emotions in a
yes,
different way?
yes. So let's get into talking about emotions from a mental health standpoint. So let's start with the question, why do we have emotions? What's the point?
So this is a fairly common topic in my
Hmm.
office, and here's how it typically comes up is you'll have someone come in and they are being emotional about something, they're sad about something. It could be a breakup, and or certainly grief is a strong emotion. And they hate that. They hate the feeling of being sad. And so they want to solve it. And they say, why can't I just get rid of these emotions?
Hmm.
And so we have to think about, why did we evolve to have the emotions?
Hmm.
And there are different theories. It's going to be a waste of time to go into all these theories, and I think it would bore our listeners a lot. So I'm just going to go with my favorite, which is certainly the one Charles Darwin proposed, is that there's an evolutionary reason to have these emotions because they help in keeping the species going.
Hmm.
So here's some reasons. I think the main reason is they help us to form bonds. So, and I think I said this to you last week, as we were talking before or after our recording, is that I think this holds true even if you're, say, a spiritual person or a religious person
Hmm.
and you believe in a God that created you. He or she created you with these emotions.
Hmm.
And so you have to wonder, what's the reason for that? There's got to be a reason, that either if you believe in evolution or if you believe in creation. And I think the reason is, it first and foremost, it helps us to form bonds, and it helps us to predict events in the world. And that is really helpful for us and useful for us.
Yeah.
So emotions, like if we think about fear, so fear or happiness, joy. But if you think about fear, fear gets our attention, and it typically wants a response
Yeah.
from us. And it can also act as a motivator. So for instance, here's a common fear that people have, the fear of snakes.
Hmm.
And a lot of, I don't know, sociologists, I think more biologists have, talked about what is the reason that many of us, not everyone, but many people have an innate fear of snakes. And they believe it's evolutionary because as you're walking again out in the savannah, you have to be really careful of these things that could kill you.
Yeah.
And, in some parts of the world, there are snakes that are very, very deadly that you have to
Hmm.
be incredibly careful of. And so, over tens of thousands of years, I think we then get that kind of inborn fear. that
Mm-hmm.
emotion of snakes, of these things. And so it's a motivator, and it helps us to take action. If you have a fear of heights,
Mm-hmm.
you're standing on the edge of something, you really need to be careful
Yeah.
because you could easily slip and fall. So fear is a motivator. I think anger gives us, really good information. It tells us be aware of whatever situation you're in,
Mm-hmm.
and then you may need to take some action. If you're angry about what someone is saying to you or doing to you, then that causes you generally to take some action. I mean, isn't that true for you if you get angry at someone?
Y- Yeah, it usually does, but I try to keep a tight rein on my anger, I guess.
Hmm.
I mean,
Hmm.
just because I feel like when it does get out, it gets really big. I guess I'm thinking of fear from a physiological standpoint, and when we're in a sense of heightened fear, it triggers our fight or flight response,
Right. Yes.
which can be crucial for surviving even today. I mean, when you think about what's going on when your flight or fight response is triggered, I mean, your body will stop all production of everything
Mhm.
else. I mean, it can
Mhm.
stop digestion, you can
Yeah.
stop in the middle of ovulating. All of these systems that usually work very cohesively in your body stop, and it all goes towards triggering adrenaline. You either get an extra boost of speed or strength to
Mhm.
help you overcome. And I think anger, I would imagine that anger would help us in that it gives us passion or a reason to fight. I mean,
Mhm.
think about a war and
Yeah.
defending yourself. You need anger. I mean, if someone comes up and they want to do you harm,
Right.
you know,
Or they're threatening your family.
exactly. Yeah. If someone is threatening your family, that anger can help trigger a response to protect
Protect.
yourself.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think the other thing that emotions can give us, because we've talked previously about empathy and how
Hmm.
important empathy is. And so empathy is a reminder for our listeners. It's just that ability to put yourself in the other person's emotional space. And
Hmm.
so what that allows us to do, if we can really relate to how the other person is feeling, then it allows us to act in the other person's with the other person's needs in mind or in the other person's interests and not just our own.
Yeah.
And I think that's true within the family group. I think it's true within the larger culture. And that's the basis of society, is that really we need to be able to act in each other's best interests. That's how we keep
Hmm.
going. That's the theory that I think is fits for me anyway the best, is that there are reasons for us to have these emotions, and it's about forming bonds that help us to survive.
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about empathy, it makes me think of my response to books and movies, particularly
Uh-huh.
movies. I have a hard time with certain movies. Like a good example is Les Miserables. I can't watch that movie.
What's hard about it for you?
I get so emotionally invested in characters and I put myself in their situation and I feel those emotions and it makes me depressed, whatever that character is going through. Or if there's just a lot of like really sadness, and sometimes I'm okay, sometimes I'm not. And a lot of it depends too on my emotional state at the time. Like sometimes I can handle stuff like that. I can handle sadder things, like a lot of death or tragedy. But then there's other times where I'm like, I can't do this right now. This is too much. This makes me feel too heavy and too depressed. And I just want to walk away from it.
Right. And we can come back to some of the reasons what that might be. So, but let's go back to Les Miserables, because
Hmm.
I'm the theme, when I think about that show, it seems like the theme is injustice. Does that
Okay.
fit for you?
Probably. I think so. Oh, I mean, the overall arching theme, but I couldn't get to that point. I think we ended up fast forwarding to the end
Hmm.
because I mean, it was just too much. Just so much sadness and hurt. So we ended up fast forwarding to the end where justice wins out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but if you think about that, that if we have that empathy that allows us to see the injustice in the world, what you're really doing is you're looking out for, I mean, it's that instinct to look out for someone else.
Yeah.
And I've had that experience myself where movies
Hmm.
make me really uncomfortable. Have you ever seen Dr. Zhivago? That's a
Uh-uh.
pretty old one. And so Dr. Zhivago it takes place right before the Russian Revolution. But here's the thing that you get to know his family, Dr. Schwago and his family, his wife, and then he goes off and has an affair. And
Mm-hmm.
I had such a strong reaction to him
Yeah.
going off and having this affair. I think I did have to turn it off, or at least anyway, I had a very strong reaction to it.
Because, I mean, you can't picture yourself doing something like, how can somebody do that to someone they love?
It goes back to that theme of injustice almost, that it's not fair. Or how can you make a promise to your wife and then break the promise? Which I often think that in my head when I'm
Mm-hmm.
working with clients who've had affairs. I don't say it because I try
Right.
and have empathy, but
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the things that I do wonder about. So,
For me, what triggers this response for me is innocence. Is when I guess injustice happens to, maybe it is an injustice thing, but when something's happening to innocent people, I
right.
mean, or another thing I really struggle with, I have this irrational aversion to death. I mean, obviously no one likes dying, but I can't kill things and I can't watch animals be killed. I understand the cycle of life and I know that that's nature, and I don't even have a problem with people hunting recreationally. I that
Mhm.
doesn't I It's not like I'm anti hunting and anti, I mean, I'm not a vegetarian or anything like that. I have no problem eating meat, but I personally can't watch or be involved in any part of the killing. It goes so far, I won't even kill bugs. If there's a spider in my house and I'm like 95% sure it's not poisonous, I'll just let it go.
Uh-huh.
I'll just let it
What
be, or
what do you do if it's Black Widow?
I make Curtis kill it. And it's not even because I'm
Okay.
scared. I'm not and it's I'm not scared of the spider. I can't kill it because I don't like it dying. And so I trap it under a cup and I tell Curtis and he
Curtis the
takes care of it.
Executioner. Okay.
It doesn't bother him, but he knows that it bothers me. And so, and I've done it before. There was a time where I'm like, ugh, this looks like it could be a poisonous spider. And Curtis wasn't around and my kids were there. And so I killed it because I absolutely had to. But, if I don't have to, I won't, because I don't like things dying. I mean, what did that bug do wrong?
Right.
Maybe it goes back to the injustice.
Invading your space. So a lot of people, a lot of couples anyway, they come in and they want to, they're concerned about their kids.
Hmm.
And how do you teach children
Yes.
about acceptable, I don't know if that's the right word, acceptable emotional
Outlets.
expression?
Yeah.
And so I think I've mentioned before, I'll just mention one more time, I won't go into detail. John Gottman has a really good program or a video that deals with this, and
Hmm.
it's called a couple of things. And sometimes he calls it the art of parenting,
Hmm.
and in other places he calls it emotion coaching, which
Yeah.
is probably the way that you'll find it. But if you go to gottman.com under parenting resources, that's where you'll find this. And essentially, here it is in a nutshell, is that in order to help children learn what we might call that appropriate expression of emotions, first you have to be able to have empathy for them. And you
Hmm.
have to be able to, like if your kid is upset, they aren't going to come to you and say, I'm really upset or I'm really angry or I'm afraid. We have to teach them what that is
Yeah.
before they can then come and express it. And so, if we have empathy, if we're tuned into them, which goes back to attachment, which
Hmm.
again, I think we've talked about, that we can say, to your little child, it seems like you're afraid right now. And you can let them respond to that. Once you throw it out there,
Hmm.
then it either sticks or it doesn't stick. But
Right.
at least the first thing he says it's really important for us as parents to do is to label the
The
emotion,
emotion. Hmm.
to label it, to give them a vocabulary in which to describe whatever it is they're feeling. And then, you can have that empathy for the emotion. Yes, I understand you're afraid. And then you can talk about acceptable behavior. So if we switch the example to, say, siblings who are angry at each other and they want to,
Hmm.
beat on each other, right? Which is
Yep.
pretty common. You can say, I get it. You're angry. And yes, here's what happened. It's not okay to hit. And
Uh-huh.
here, let's talk about other things that you can do. And so I think that's the way we can help our children, one, to be aware of their emotions, to be able to express them articulately, and then two, to have reasonable responses to them.
And I think one important step in that is talking about your own emotions, which
Mm-hmm.
as adults is very hard to do. But I think it's important to tell your kids how you're feeling. There's been times where I've told my kids, that's too much, that's overwhelming, or I'm feeling really frustrated right now. I need you to back off and give me some space. Or that's too loud and it's bothering me right now, or even just saying, I feel really sad right now. I think just talking about emotions and explaining to kids your own emotions, it can help them not only to develop empathy, but to be able to understand their own emotions.
Yeah, I agree that sometimes parents are reluctant to
Mm-hmm.
be emotional in front of their kids. And I think that's a big mistake
Yeah.
because how else do they learn? And how else do they learn the appropriate expression of
Yeah.
those emotions? I mean, that's our job, is to teach them
Mm-hmm.
that. So I agree with you. The emotions, people call them the bad emotions, like being sad or angry. It's okay to say, I'm feeling sad right now, and here's the
Yeah.
reason I'm feeling sad right now. And you can even say, here's what I think I'll do about it, and
Yeah.
whatever it is. So you can help the child learn that just because you're experiencing emotion doesn't mean it has to take over your life, and that
Mm-hmm.
you still have some element of control and that you can take some sort of action typically.
Yeah.
So I think this is common with children when it feels like they're out of control. And I think you mentioned a few minutes ago that sometimes you don't want to handle an emotion in the moment. I think being tired is probably
Yes.
maybe the main thing, both for kids and adults, that makes it difficult for us to maybe tolerate an emotion that, if we weren't tired, it'd be fine. We'd be doing fine to experience that emotion. But if we're
Mm-hmm.
tired, the other one, if we're hungry, I think that there's a popular word called hangry, which
Yes.
is, I guess is
That's
a
that's a new
combination
word.
of,
Hungry
of
and angry. Yeah.
hungry and angry. One of my grandkids certainly has that. We have to make sure, the youngest, we have to make sure that he doesn't go too long without eating. And we always have to you have to force him to come up and eat something. Otherwise, it can fall apart very, very quickly. Because there are some people who are hypoglycemic, is what we call that, and they need to learn how to live with that. What do you do? How do you take care of yourself? What's the self-care? And if
Mm-hmm.
you're that's necessary for that, if you're going to be in an emotionally difficult situation, probably you need good sleep. It's going to be much worse if you don't get the sleep you need, if you're tired, if you're hungry, if you're thirsty. So there are things that make it more difficult for us to tolerate emotions.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it's also important to recognize that, or to be able to say to yourself, I recognize that I'm tired and I'm not handling this right. And that can be very, very hard to do in the moment. And I am guilty all the time of overreacting to something and then coming back and saying, oh, I was tired, or that was an overreaction, and being able to label it. But even if you're doing it after the fact, I think it's still important to recognize that and label what's causing you to not handle this situation well. I think that is very important
I
for
agree.
us to be able to do.
I think that one, it shows that you're taking responsibility for your own
Mm-hmm.
behavior and your own emotional experience. Again, with children or even with significant others or anyone else, I think it's fine to say, you know what, I did overreact to that. And I think people really appreciate it. I think children really appreciate it. And it teaches them a valuable lesson of, yeah, you know what, sometimes mom and dad can overreact, but they can actually acknowledge it
Mm-hmm.
and then do some sort of repair
Yeah.
around it. And
Yeah.
so those are really good lessons. I think the mistake, and I see people all the time who grow up in families, it's not okay to express emotions. That's a huge
Mm-hmm.
mistake.
Mm-hmm.
And it causes lifelong problems because then the next step is usually those adults want to enter into an intimate relationship. Again,
Yeah.
it's one of those things that if we go back to Darwin, that we're drawn to, right? We want to
Mm-hmm.
enter into that relationship, I think primarily so we can procreate, but also because that's together we're stronger than we are separate.
Yeah.
And so I see couples all the time where one, rarely both, but at least one has trouble with emotional expression. Often it's the male,
Mm-hmm.
not always, but often. And so I'm often working with how do you get that healthy express, or how do you even turn that on? Because I think
Mm-hmm.
we have it. I think well, as we've been talking about, it's a learned behavior to
Mm-hmm.
be able to be introspective enough to know what you're feeling and then be able to share it. So here are the three things that I think you need to have a strong emotional connection. Because for most of the couples that I see at some point, most likely they're going to say, we would like a stronger emotional connection.
Mm-hmm.
And so the three things that you need are you have to be self aware enough to know what your internal emotional state is. And interestingly, I think most of us are. It's very rare that you'll find someone who actually doesn't know what they're feeling. The more
Mm-hmm.
common situation is, I know what I'm feeling, I'm just not going to say it out loud.
And I think it can be hard too for people to describe it. I mean, I think that they understand that they're having some sort of maybe happy emotion or a negative emotion, but they can't find the words because maybe in the moment happy, I'm feeling happy doesn't feel right, or maybe you can be feeling in love with someone, and that can be hard just because it can be vulnerable to say I love you to someone. But for example, if you're in a really committed relationship and you're in a long-term committed relationship and you've both expressed love, I think sometimes when you're feeling happiness, maybe you just don't have the right word to express I'm happy because I'm feeling in love with you right now. Maybe because of something you're doing or something we're doing together. But I think it can just be hard for people to explain the state of it. They don't know how because they don't have the right words for it.
You're right. You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. Because that's the third step. The third step,
Mhm.
I'll jump to that, is you have to have a vocabulary
Yeah.
in which to describe it. And for a lot of us, we don't have an adequate vocabulary to describe our emotions. The second
Mhm.
step, after you're self aware, is that you have a desire to share it with an intimate partner. And again, I found that most people want to do that, they just don't know how to do it. And I
Mhm.
think the primary stumbling block to that is what you just said, is that
Yeah.
they don't have the vocabulary. So I have this list that's got, I don't know how many, it's got at least a couple of hundred
Okay.
emotion words. And it's really helpful for people because if you look at this list, you're going to find words that you've never thought of before
Mhm.
that then can describe your internal state. I've had people, of individuals and or couples, I say, okay, look over this list and pick out some that really fit. And once they start going, they're able to pick out two or three, and they're words that they would have never used,
Okay.
or they're words that would have never come up, spontaneously in their mind, but they're words that fit.
Mhm.
So I think it's almost like being emotionally literate. We need to be a little bit more emotionally literate. And I don't know that we do a good job in our culture teaching people or teaching children how to be emotionally literate. So it just goes back to our job as parents
Mhm.
to, help our kids to be emotionally literate.
I consider myself fairly emotionally aware, but I know there's times where I've had to step back and say, okay, why is this creating this reaction? Because emotions will create a reaction.
Right.
And sometimes the reaction is good and sometimes the reaction is bad. I think we want to know why we're having this reaction. Why am I reacting this way? And I think that's the emotion is what's creating it. And it can be hard to define why we're reacting this way because it's not always obvious. I mean, if I walk up to you and I slap you in the face, you're going to be angry and it's going to be really obvious why, right?
Right.
But if I come up to you and I say something and you don't like what I said or I said it in a way that puts you off, then you don't know how to label the emotion that's making you feel. You just know that you don't like it and it makes you mad, and that's going to create friction in any relationship.
Right. And so one of the things that you get in talk therapy is to actually be able to go through that process where you can get a better understanding of, okay, what happened that then
Hmm.
caused this emotion to come up. But I know in past episodes, I've talked about that communication style that I try and teach couples where you listen and understand, you have that validation and empathy. And so
Hmm.
if you have a partner where you can do that well, then actually doing that with each other leads often to that self-awareness that says, oh, this is what happened. Because
Hmm.
you have someone who's helping you, who's asking some questions just to help you get to look at it possibly in a different way. And often it will come to you and you think, okay, now it makes sense.
Yeah.
So just having someone that you can talk it through with is
Right.
often all that's needed for you to make sense. Because sometimes we get stuck in our own head, and it's really hard to stuck in our own, dialogue that's going on internally.
Hmm.
And it's hard for us to sort things out when that extra person who's sitting there listening and hearing us is really helpful.
Yeah, I had an experience like that with Curtis recently. So he said, lately I've just kind of been in a funk. And
Hmm.
my first reaction that I very wisely held back was, yeah, I know. That
Well, that's good. I don't know if that qualifies as good validation.
I know.
Yeah, you're right. You're right, Curtis. You're in the phone.
That was, yeah, but that was my first thought was,
Good
yeah, I've
for you to
noticed.
hold that.
Yes. So that's what I actually said was, "Oh yeah." So I invited him to tell me more
Uh-huh.
about it. And he said, "Yeah, maybe it's just this head cold, but I've just kind of been in this mood." And he went on to further describe his emotional state. And I said, "Yeah, that totally makes sense. And you also have to consider XYZ, all these other factors that were
Mhm.
going on in his life. I mean, he recently started a new job. He
Yeah.
hasn't been sleeping well because of that. And then all of these extra factors. And I said, yeah, I can totally understand why you're feeling that way. And I don't know that we ever got to even, as you would call it, resolution, but I was able to help him understand and process the emotions that he had been feeling, and I was able to validate them.
Right.
And I think that's can be really important and helpful in a relationship.
It is. It is. It's well, see, to me, that is what you just described. That is emotional intimacy. And
Mhm.
that's what a lot of couples want, but a
Yeah.
lot of couples have difficulty getting there
Mhm.
because I actually hear this in session. Someone may say, "Yeah, no joke, you are in a
Uh-huh.
funk," and they let
Yeah.
that first thought come out. And I
Uh-huh.
and I know I've said this before. Good relationships have a lot of self-censorship.
Yes, they do.
We 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 don't get to say everything that comes into our mind. There's no reason to. And so that example that you gave is the perfect example for what emotional intimacy looks like in a
Mhm.
couple. And it's so obviously his part is he's throwing it out there. I'm in a
Yeah.
funk, and you invited, the dialogue, and he's willing to talk about it.
Yeah.
So he fits those three things. I mean, the thing that you may be missing is that vocabulary, which is hard, having a vocabulary to describe it.
Mhm.
But certainly he's self-aware and desire to share it. So,
Yeah. And I tell you what, if I had said, "Yeah, I know," if I had actually said that, it would have instantly cut off
well, he probably
any.
would have been defensive.
Yeah, exactly. He would have immediately jumped to defense, and that's not going to help. I mean, it would have been a complete missed opportunity there. Like you said, that censorship. And I think another thing that it's going to be important to realize in having good emotional intimacy is to recognize that you're not always going to be able to label your emotions in the moment. When you're
Right.
feeling those emotions, it's really, really hard to label them and understand them. And that's where I think a lot of problems occur, is because in the moment it's hard. So I think
Mhm.
you just need to understand that. And that's where empathy and giving people grace and forgiveness comes in, because hindsight is 2020.
Yeah. Another issue, maybe one of the final things we can talk about tonight is that I get a lot of people in my office who for years have been trying to suppress their emotions, and they think
Mhm.
that's the right way to to be. And often it's, again, I don't want to make generalizations, but it kind of fits. Often it's men because they've learned that that's what they need to do. And that I think is a huge mistake because, you can't just stuff it away and think it's going to go away. It's always there. And if you do that too much, it leaks out in other ways. And so the way I see it often in couples is one person might be frustrated or even angry with the other person. They don't deal with it. And so they're holding all this in. And 3 months later, something tiny comes up and it just, boom, it explodes all out. It leaks out all over the place. And so it's important to realize that if you can get out and express the emotion more in the moment and not let it build up to where it's really big, it's much easier to hear and to listen to. And it's much easier for both of you to tolerate the expression of the emotion. And I see it all the time where, someone might be angry or frustrated and they hold it in, and then boom, it comes out. And that's really hard. That is what destroys relationships.
Right. And when the emotions do start to get big, I think it's also very important to be aware that, okay, our emotions are getting really big, we're getting loud, we're getting really frustrated, and to recognize this conversation has officially lost all productivity. Let's take a step back, put a pin in this.
Take a time out.
Yes, take a time out. That is absolutely 100% okay to do. So next week, we are going to get into a good topic of setting boundaries. And we're going to talk specifically about setting boundaries around the holidays with those coming up because
the days are here already after Halloween.
They are. Yeah, they are. They are fast approaching. And holidays can be wonderful and bring people together, but they can also be incredibly stressful and hard. And I would imagine that the majority of that has to do with proper boundaries not being put in place. So
you're absolutely right.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about that, break that down, maybe talk about some ways we can set healthy boundaries. We'll give you some good tips and some good advice, and we will see you all next week.
Have a good week.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.